Sarah stood at the threshold of her family home, heart pounding as she prepared to confront her loved ones. The weight of her decision to leave her family and the church community she had grown up in pressed heavily upon her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the inevitable conflict. Inside, the familiar sounds of family life drifted through the air, voices mingled with laughter and the clatter of dishes, but Sarah's mind was elsewhere. She squared her shoulders and pushed open the door, stepping into the warmth of the familiar surroundings. Immediately, she was met with concerned looks and questioning gazes from her family members. Her parents sat at the kitchen table, their expressions a mix of confusion and apprehension. Sarah's siblings glanced up from their homework, sensing the tension in the air. Without hesitation, Sarah addressed her family, her voice steady despite the turmoil roiling within her. "I need to talk to you all," she began, her tone firm yet tinged with vulnerability. Her parents exchanged a worried glance, sensing the seriousness of Sarah's demeanor. "What is it, Sarah?" her mother asked, her voice gentle but tinged with apprehension. Taking a moment to gather her thoughts, Sarah met her parents' gaze with determination. "I've made a decision," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm leaving." Her words hung heavy in the air, the silence that followed filled with a sense of disbelief. Her family stared at her in stunned silence, processing the gravity of her announcement. As Sarah's family members exchanged bewildered glances, Sarah pressed on, her resolve unwavering despite the uncertainty that gnawed at her insides. "I've realized that I need to live my life on my own terms," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I can't continue to conform to expectations that don't align with who I am." Her parents exchanged a glance, their expressions a mixture of concern and disbelief. "But Sarah, the church has always been such an important part of our lives," her father interjected, his tone pleading. Sarah met her father's gaze, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I know, Dad," she replied softly, "but I can't ignore the feeling in my heart that there's more to life than what I've been taught." Her words hung in the air, the weight of her decision palpable in the room. For a moment, no one spoke, each grappling with their own emotions and thoughts. Finally, Sarah's mother spoke, her voice tinged with sorrow. "We'll always love you, Sarah," she said, reaching out to grasp her daughter's hand. "But we can't force you to stay if it's not where you belong." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she squeezed her mother's hand, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness wash over her. Despite the pain of leaving her family behind, she knew deep down that she was making the right choice for herself. With a heavy heart, Sarah turned to leave, knowing that this would be the last time she crossed the threshold of her childhood home. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a sense of freedom wash over her, mingled with the weight of the unknown that lay ahead. Sarah stood in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by memories of a life she was about to leave behind. The weight of her decision to embark on this journey with Alex settled heavily on her shoulders, but she knew deep down that it was the right choice. With a determined expression, Sarah began packing her belongings into a small suitcase, carefully selecting items that held sentimental value or practical utility. Each item she packed carried with it a mix of emotions, nostalgia for the past and excitement for the future. As she folded her clothes and tucked away keepsakes from her childhood, Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness at the thought of leaving her family behind. She knew that this journey would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine, and the prospect both thrilled and terrified her. Outside her bedroom door, she could hear the sounds of her family going about their daily routines. The familiar hum of conversation and laughter served as a poignant reminder of the life she was leaving behind. But Sarah was resolute in her decision, determined to carve out her own path in the world. Finally, as the last of her belongings found their place in the suitcase, Sarah took a moment to survey her room one last time. Memories flashed before her eyes, birthday parties, family dinners, quiet moments of reflection, each one a thread in the tapestry of her life. With a deep breath, Sarah zipped up her suitcase and slung it over her shoulder. The weight of it pressed against her, a physical reminder of the journey she was about to embark on. Stepping out of her room, she made her way downstairs to face her family and say her goodbyes. As Sarah descended the stairs, she was met with a mixture of emotions from her family. Her parents stood in the living room, their faces etched with concern and sadness. Her siblings hovered nearby, unsure of how to react to Sarah's departure. With a heavy heart, Sarah approached her parents, her suitcase weighing heavily in her hand. She could feel the weight of their expectations and hopes for her future pressing down on her, but she knew she had to follow her own path. "Mom, Dad," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I want you to know that I love you, and I appreciate everything you've done for me." Her parents exchanged a somber glance, their expressions softening with understanding. They knew that Sarah's decision was not made lightly, and they respected her courage in following her heart. "We love you too, Sarah," her mother said, her voice catching in her throat. "We may not understand your decision completely, but we trust that you know what's best for yourself." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she embraced her parents tightly, feeling the weight of their love and support enveloping her. In that moment, she knew that no matter where her journey took her, she would always carry their love with her. Turning to her siblings, Sarah offered them a small smile, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she would miss them dearly. They exchanged tearful hugs and whispered words of encouragement, promising to stay in touch despite the distance between them. With one last look around the familiar surroundings of her childhood home, Sarah took a deep breath and stepped outside into the warm embrace of the afternoon sun. The future stretched out before her, filled with uncertainty and possibility, but she knew that with Alex by her side, she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Sarah and Alex hit the open road, their spirits high as they set out on their journey together. The sun beat down on the asphalt, casting long shadows across the landscape as they drove onward into the unknown. With each passing mile, the scenery changed, morphing from familiar countryside to unfamiliar terrain. Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of exhilaration at the prospect of exploring new places and experiencing new adventures with Alex by her side. As they drove, they talked and laughed, sharing stories and dreams for the future. Alex's easygoing nature helped to ease Sarah's nerves, and she found herself growing more confident with each passing mile. But their journey was not without its challenges. Along the way, they encountered road construction, detours, and unexpected delays that tested their patience and resolve. Despite these obstacles, they pressed on, determined to reach their destination no matter what. As the day wore on, they grew weary from the long hours on the road. Sarah's eyes drooped with exhaustion, and she leaned her head against the window, grateful for Alex's steady presence behind the wheel. Just when it seemed they couldn't drive another mile, they spotted a small roadside diner up ahead. With a sigh of relief, Alex pulled into the parking lot, and they stepped out of the car, stretching their cramped muscles and inhaling the scent of fresh air. Inside the diner, they found respite from the heat of the day, the cool air conditioning washing over them like a welcome embrace. They settled into a booth by the window, ordering burgers and fries with a side of ice-cold drinks. As they ate, they reflected on the day's journey, sharing stories of the sights they had seen and the challenges they had overcome. Despite the fatigue that weighed heavily on their bodies, they couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment at how far they had come. But their rest was short-lived, as they knew they still had many miles to go before reaching their final destination. With renewed determination, they finished their meal and set out once more. As Sarah and Alex resumed their journey, the landscape stretched out before them, a vast expanse of rolling hills and open skies. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the horizon as they drove into the evening. With the windows rolled down, they breathed in the crisp evening air, the cool breeze washing over them like a soothing balm. Sarah felt a sense of freedom wash over her, the worries and anxieties of the day fading away with each passing mile. But as darkness fell, so too did their fatigue. Sarah's eyelids grew heavy, and she struggled to stay awake behind the wheel. Sensing her exhaustion, Alex offered to take over driving duties, and Sarah gratefully relinquished control. grateful for his steady hand at the wheel. As Alex drove, Sarah drifted off to sleep, her head resting against the window as the gentle hum of the engine lulled her into a peaceful slumber. In her dreams, she saw glimpses of the adventures that awaited them, each one more thrilling than the last. Hours passed in blissful silence as they journeyed through the night, the only sound the steady rhythm of the road beneath their tires. The world outside seemed to blur together, a blur of lights and shadows as they drove onward into the unknown. But just as Sarah began to drift into a deeper sleep, a sudden jolt jolted her awake. Startled, she sat up in her seat, heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Beside her, Alex cursed under his breath as he struggled to regain control of the car. Sarah's heart raced as she peered out the window, her eyes widening in horror as she saw the figure of a deer darting across the road. With lightning-fast reflexes, Alex swerved to avoid the animal, the car skidding dangerously close to the edge of the road before coming to a stop. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized how narrowly they had escaped disaster. Shaken but unharmed, they sat in stunned silence for a moment, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. Slowly, they turned to each other, relief flooding their faces as they realized they were safe. In that moment, Sarah felt a renewed sense of gratitude for Alex's presence by her side. Despite the dangers and uncertainties of the road, she knew that as long as they were together, they could face whatever challenges came their way. With a shared glance and a silent nod, they pressed onward into the night. While Sarah and Alex's car rolled into the bustling streets of the new city, they were greeted by a cacophony of sounds and sights unlike anything they had ever experienced. Tall buildings loomed overhead, casting long shadows over the crowded sidewalks as people hurried past, lost in their own worlds. Despite the excitement of their new surroundings, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of apprehension that gnawed at her insides. The city seemed vast and overwhelming, a maze of unfamiliar streets and faces that left her feeling small and insignificant. Beside her, Alex gripped the steering wheel tightly, his brow furrowed with concentration as he navigated the crowded streets. Despite his usual confidence, Sarah could sense the uncertainty that lurked beneath the surface, mirrored in the tense set of his shoulders and the tightness of his jaw. As they drove through the heart of the city, Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of homesickness for the quiet countryside they had left behind. The hustle and bustle of urban life seemed foreign and intimidating, a stark contrast to the familiar comforts of home. But as they drove further into the city, Sarah's apprehension began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of excitement and possibility. Despite the challenges that lay ahead, she knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, a chance to start fresh and pursue their dreams without looking back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at their new apartment building, a modest brick structure nestled among towering skyscrapers. As they unloaded their belongings from the car and carried them up to their new home, Sarah felt a surge of pride and determination wash over her. This was their chance to carve out a new life for themselves, to build a future filled with hope and possibility. And as they stepped across the threshold of their new apartment, Sarah knew that no matter what challenges they faced, they would face them together, hand in hand. Sarah and Alex settled into their new apartment. They were met with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The space was small but cozy, with sunlight streaming in through the windows and casting warm pools of light on the hardwood floors. Despite the charm of their new home, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of her mind. The reality of their situation began to sink in. They were in a new city, far from the comforts of home, with no job prospects and a limited budget to sustain them. For a moment, they unpacked their belongings and began to settle into their new routine. Sarah found herself plagued by doubts and insecurities. What if they couldn't find work? What if they couldn't afford rent? What if they had made a terrible mistake in leaving everything behind? Beside her, Alex seemed unfazed by their predicament, his easygoing nature serving as a source of comfort and reassurance. He joked and laughed as they unpacked, his infectious optimism helping to ease Sarah's fears and lift her spirits. But beneath the surface, Sarah could sense the strain that their situation was placing on their relationship. The constant uncertainty and financial stress threatened to drive a wedge between them, testing the strength of their bond in ways they had never anticipated. Despite the challenges they faced, Sarah refused to give up hope. She knew that they were capable of overcoming whatever obstacles stood in their way, as long as they faced them together. With determination and resilience, she was determined to make their new life in the city a success. The day is going away. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the city lights began to twinkle outside their window. Sarah felt a glimmer of optimism begin to stir within her. Despite the uncertainties that lay ahead, she knew that this was just the beginning of their journey, and that with perseverance and courage, they could build a future filled with promise and possibility. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah and Alex faced their fair share of challenges in their new city. They struggled to find stable employment, facing rejection after rejection as they applied for job after job. Money grew tight, and tensions rose as they grappled with the harsh realities of city life. But through it all, they clung to each other, finding strength and solace in their shared determination to overcome adversity. They leaned on each other for support, offering words of encouragement and comfort during the darkest moments. And slowly but surely, things began to turn around. Sarah landed a job at a local cafe, while Alex found work as a freelance graphic designer. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to pay the bills and keep a roof over their heads. As they settled into their new routine, Sarah and Alex found themselves growing closer than ever before. They explored the city together, discovering hidden gems and secret spots that quickly became their favorite haunts. They laughed, they cried, and they dreamed of the future, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could weather any storm. And as they stood on the rooftop of their apartment building, watching the sun set over the city skyline, Sarah knew that they had made the right decision in embarking on this journey together. Despite the hardships and uncertainties, they had found a sense of belonging in this bustling metropolis, a place where they could truly be themselves and chase their dreams without fear or hesitation. With a smile and a sigh of contentment, Sarah reached for Alex's hand, squeezing it tightly in hers. Together, they looked out at the twinkling lights of the city below, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment wash over them. This was their city now, their home. And as they stood there together, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, Sarah knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, hand in hand. Tension crackled in the air as Sarah and Alex sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence between them thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she traced the rim of her coffee mug, her gaze fixed on a spot somewhere in the distance. Alex shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw clenched tight as he struggled to find the right words to break the suffocating silence. He knew that their disagreement couldn't be ignored any longer, but the thought of confronting Sarah filled him with a sense of dread. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, Alex cleared his throat and spoke, his voice tense and strained. "Sarah, we need to talk," he began, his words hesitant but determined. Sarah's eyes snapped up to meet his, a flicker of apprehension crossing her features before she schooled her expression into a mask of stoicism. "About what?" she replied, her tone cool and guarded. Alex swallowed hard, steeling himself for the conversation that was about to unfold. "About us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About where we're going and what we want from this relationship." Sarah's heart clenched at his words, a surge of fear and uncertainty washing over her. She had known that this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it any less daunting. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alex took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers as he spoke. "I mean that we've been avoiding the elephant in the room for too long," he said, his tone tinged with frustration. "We can't keep pretending like everything's okay when it's not." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as the weight of Alex's words settled over her like a heavy blanket. She knew that he was right. Their relationship had been strained for months, held together by little more than habit and inertia. But the thought of confronting their problems head-on filled her with a sense of dread. What if they couldn't find a way to work through their issues? What if this was the end of the road for them? As the silence stretched between them, Sarah felt the walls closing in around her, suffocating her with the weight of their unresolved conflicts. She knew that they couldn't avoid this conversation any longer, no matter how much it terrified her. Alex's gaze softened as he reached across the table, gently taking Sarah's trembling hand in his own. "Sarah, I love you," he said, his voice earnest and pleading. "But we can't keep ignoring the issues that are tearing us apart." Sarah's breath caught in her throat at his words, a swell of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. She knew that Alex was right. Their relationship had been hanging by a thread for far too long, and it was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "I love you too, Alex," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I don't know if we can fix this." Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke, the weight of their shared struggles bearing down on her like a heavy burden. She had always believed that love could conquer anything, but now she wasn't so sure. Alex squeezed her hand gently, his eyes searching hers for some sign of hope. "We have to try, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We owe it to ourselves to at least try to work through this." Sarah nodded slowly, her heart heavy with uncertainty, but also a glimmer of hope. She knew that they had a long road ahead of them, filled with obstacles and challenges, but she also knew that if they faced them together, they might just have a chance. Taking a deep breath, Sarah met Alex's gaze with a newfound sense of resolve. "Okay," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside her. "Let's try," and with that simple word, a weight lifted from Sarah's shoulders, replaced by a sense of determination and purpose. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know what the future held, but they were willing to take a leap of faith and see where it led them. As they sat together at the kitchen table, hands clasped tightly, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope begin to blossom in her heart. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger and more resilient than ever before. As Sarah and Alex sat in tense silence, the weight of their conversation hanging heavy in the air, a sense of anticipation filled the room. They had made a tentative agreement to try and work through their issues, but both knew that the road ahead would be far from easy. With a heavy sigh, Alex rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate as he stepped away from the table. Sarah watched him, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for him to speak. "Sarah," Alex began, his voice low and measured, "there's something I need to tell you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat at his words, a sense of foreboding settling over her like a dark cloud. She had known that there were still secrets between them, things left unsaid and unspoken, but she hadn't expected Alex to bring them up now, in the midst of their fragile reconciliation. "What is it, Alex?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex hesitated for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor as he struggled to find the right words. "There's something I've been keeping from you," he finally admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. Sarah's heart sank at his confession, a knot of fear and uncertainty tightening in the pit of her stomach. What could Alex possibly have been hiding from her, and how would it affect their already fragile relationship? But before she could press him for more information, a loud knock echoed through the apartment, breaking the tension like a bolt of lightning. Sarah's pulse quickened at the sound, her mind racing with 1,000 different possibilities. With a wary glance at each other, Sarah and Alex made their way to the door, their hearts pounding in their chests as they prepared to face whatever lay on the other side. As Alex reached for the doorknob, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change forever. With bated breath, she braced herself for the revelation that awaited them on the other side of the door, knowing that whatever it was, it would test the strength of their love and their commitment to each other. And as the door swung open to reveal the unexpected visitor standing on their doorstep, Sarah felt a surge of apprehension wash over her, leaving her trembling. Sarah and Alex stood frozen in the doorway, uncertainty hung heavy in the air, each moment stretching out like an eternity as they awaited the identity of their unexpected visitor. With a mixture of trepidation and curiosity, Sarah hesitated before finally mustering the courage to speak. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure on the other side of the door remained shrouded in shadow, a mysterious presence that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. With a sense of foreboding, she braced herself for whatever revelation awaited them, knowing that their lives were about to change forever. As the figure stepped forward into the dim light of the apartment, Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the familiar face staring back at her. It was her father, his expression grave and determined as he met her gaze with unwavering intensity. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "We need to talk." Sarah's pulse quickened at her father's words, a surge of fear and uncertainty washing over her as she struggled to make sense of the situation. What could her father possibly want from her now, after all this time? With a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, Sarah realized that this conversation would not be an easy one. Whatever her father had to say, it had the potential to change everything, to upend the fragile peace they had fought so hard to find. But as she met her father's gaze, Sarah knew that she couldn't turn away from the truth any longer. Whatever secrets lay buried in their past, they needed to be brought to light, no matter how painful it might be. Taking a deep breath, Sarah squared her shoulders and nodded, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside her. "Okay, Dad," she said, her tone resolute. "Let's talk." And with that simple word, Sarah stepped aside to let her father into the apartment, knowing that whatever revelations awaited them, they would face them together, as a family. Sarah's father stepped into the apartment. Alex's gaze shifted between them, his brow furrowing with concern as he sensed the tension in the air. He had been on the verge of saying something to Sarah before the unexpected interruption, and now he stood silently by her side, waiting for the conversation to unfold. Sarah's father glanced briefly at Alex, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to his daughter. "Sarah," he began, his voice tinged with regret, "I owe you an apology." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at her father's words, a flood of conflicting emotions washing over her as she struggled to process what he was saying. She had longed for her father's acknowledgement and acceptance for so long, and now that it was finally within reach, she didn't know how to respond. With a sense of apprehension, Sarah nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "What for?" Her father sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his confession. "For pushing you away," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "For not being there for you when you needed me the most." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she listened to her father's words, a mixture of sadness and relief washing over her as she finally heard the apology she had been longing for. Despite the years of hurt and resentment, she couldn't deny the overwhelming sense of forgiveness that flooded her heart in that moment. With a trembling hand, Sarah reached out to her father, her fingers brushing against his in a tentative gesture of reconciliation. "It's okay, Dad," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I forgive you." Her father's eyes filled with tears as he pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close as if afraid to let her go. And in that moment, Sarah felt a sense of healing and closure wash over her, as years of pain and resentment melted away in the warmth of her father's embrace. Beside them, Alex watched the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and admiration, his heart swelling with love and pride for the woman he loved. Despite the challenges they had faced, he knew that they were stronger together, united in their shared determination to overcome whatever obstacles life threw their way. As they stood together in the quiet stillness of the apartment, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her like a warm blanket, knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it together as a family. As the emotional tension began to dissipate, Alex stepped forward, his voice quiet but determined. "Sarah," he began, his gaze locking with hers, "there's something I need to say." Sarah turned to him, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for him to speak. Despite the weight of her father's confession and the reconciliation that had followed, She couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of her mind. Taking a deep breath, Alex reached out to grasp Sarah's hand in his own, his touch gentle but firm. "I love you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "And I want what's best for you, no matter what that may be." Sarah felt a surge of emotion wash over her at his words, a mixture of love and gratitude filling her heart. Despite the uncertainties that lay ahead, she knew that she could always count on Alex to support her, to stand by her side through thick and thin. With tears welling up in her eyes, Sarah leaned into Alex's embrace, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for always being there for me, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Alex held her close, his heart overflowing with love for the woman he cherished above all else. In that moment, he knew that no matter what challenges they faced, they would face them together, hand in hand, ready to take on whatever the future held. But as the warmth of their embrace enveloped them, Sarah's father cleared his throat, reminding them of the decision that still lay before them. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle but insistent, "you have a choice to make. You can stay here with Alex, or you can come back home with me." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at her father's words, the weight of his ultimatum settling over her like a heavy blanket. She knew that whatever decision she made would have far-reaching consequences, shaping the course of her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. With a sense of determination, Sarah pulled away from Alex's embrace, her gaze locking with her father's as she made her decision. "I choose to stay," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that still lingered in her heart. "I choose to be with Alex no matter what." As her father's expression softened with understanding, Sarah felt a pang of guilt wash over her, knowing that she had hurt him deeply by leaving without a word. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling with emotion, "I'm sorry for the way I left. I didn't mean to hurt you." Her father reached out to her, enveloping her in a warm embrace that spoke volumes of his forgiveness and love. "It's okay, Sarah," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I understand why you needed to go, and I'm just glad to see you happy." With a final goodbye, Sarah's father left the room, leaving Sarah and Alex alone to face the future together, hand in hand, ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead.